All right, let's dive right in to the 100 Years' War. Now, I know what you're thinking. 100 years, that's a long war. And yeah, you're not wrong. It actually lasted 116 years.
Yeah.
Crazy, right?
It really is.
But today we're using some encyclopedia excerpts to get to the bottom of this thing. And trust me, there's so much more to this story than just dates and battles.
Oh, absolutely.
So are you ready to uncover some surprises about medieval Europe?
I am. I'm all ears.
Okay, great. So first things first, it's the 14th century. Europe's a bit of a mess, right? There's all this political turmoil.
Yeah, it was a pretty volatile time.
And then, bam, the Black Death hits. Wipes out like half of France's population.
It's hard to even grasp the scale of that devastation.
I know, right? It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
So you can't just talk about a war in a vacuum,
Yeah.
right? This backdrop of like chaos and disease, it sets the stage for everything that follows.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
all interconnected. The Black Death impacted everything from social structures to economics. It's no wonder tensions were running hot.
Okay, so we've got this powder keg of a situation. But what actually lit the fuse? I mean, was it really just a family feud over who got to wear the French crown?
Well, the disputed succession was definitely the spark stresser. Charles IV of France dies without a son.
No heir, huh?
Right. And that left his nephew, Edward III of England, thinking, hey, that crown should be mine.
Family drama on a royal scale. But I bet the French weren't too keen on having an English king calling the shots.
They were not. They invoked something called Silic law, which basically prevented inheritance through the female line.
So Edward's claim was through his mother.
Exactly. And this meant the crown went to a more distant relative, Philip VI of France.
Ah, so Edward gets snubbed. And all that simmering tension boils over. But this wasn't just about her feelings, right?
Yeah.
What else was fueling this conflict?
Well, you have to consider that England already controlled large chunks of what was technically French territory.
Like where?
Places like Guyenne and Gascony. These were powerful, wealthy regions.
So the English kings were basically both powerful French nobles and potential rivals to the French crown.
Precisely. It was a very delicate balancing act.
Talk about an awkward dynamic. And then, to complicate things even further, you've got the old alliance between France and Scotland.
Ah, yes. The old alliance, always a thorn in England's side. It essentially meant that Scotland and France were united against England.
So it's like a medieval soap opera with real-world consequences.
A very apt description. It adds this whole other layer of intrigue to the conflict. But with all these alliances and rivalries, it's no wonder things eventually erupted into full-blown war.
Right. So let's talk about those early battles. Edward III really came out swinging, didn't he?
He did. In 1340, the English Navy crushed the French fleet at the Battle of Sluys.
A decisive victory.
Absolutely. And this gave them control of the English Channel, which was key for any future campaigns.
Control the seas, control the war. It's a strategy that still holds true today, right?
Absolutely timeless wisdom.
So what about Edward's son? The Black Prince. Didn't he lead the English to some pretty stunning victories on land?
The Black Prince was a legend, a brilliant military leader known for his bravery and tactical genius. And at the Battle of Crecy in 1346, he really showcased the power of the English longbow.
That weapon was a game changer, wasn't it?
It was. It could pierce armor from a distance. It had a longer range, faster rate of fire than traditional bows. It was devastating.
I can't even imagine facing that on a medieval battlefield.
It would have been terrifying. A storm of arrows raining down on you.
So after Crecy, the English went on to lay siege to Calais, right?
They did. The siege of Calais was brutal. It lasted for over a year. But the English were determined, and they captured the city in 1347.
And they held on to Calais for centuries, didn't they?
Over 200 years, it became the symbol of English power on the continent.
Wow, what a strategic prize. But of course, war is never a straight path to victory, right? There were setbacks, lulls in the fighting, and even moments where the tide seemed to turn against the English.
Absolutely. War is unpredictable. And this is also when the Black Death returned with a vengeance.
Man, not again.
It swept through Europe, halting the war and reminding everyone that nature could be just as deadly as any army.
That's like a grim equalizer.
It certainly puts things in perspective.
So amidst all this chaos, there was an attempt at peace, right? The Treaty of Bretigny.
Yes. In 1360, both sides signed the Treaty of Bretigny. Edward III agreed to give up his claim to the French throne, but in exchange, he got even more land in France. Plus, the French king, John II, had been captured earlier and held for ransom.
Oh, wow. A king held hostage. That must have been a hefty price to pay.
3 million crowns, to be exact. A massive sum that put a huge strain on the French treasury.
So even with the treaty, this peace was pretty fragile, wasn't it?
It was. The underlying tensions and resentments were still there, and eventually the fighting resumed.
And the French, under a new leader, started to push back, right?
Yeah.
Tell me about Charles V.
Charles V. He was known as Charles the Wise for a reason. He was a shrewd strategist, and he recognized that the French needed a different approach.
I'm intrigued. What was his strategy?
Well, instead of those big head-on battles, Charles focused on attrition. He favored guerrilla tactics, Fabian strategy to wear down the English.
It's like a war of attrition.
Exactly. And he appointed Bertrand du Guesclin, a brilliant military leader, to lead his armies.
So Charles V was more of a strategist, and du Guesclin was the field commander.
You could say that. And du Guesclin, he was fascinating. He wasn't a nobleman. He came from humble beginnings.
A commoner leading the French army. That's quite a change.
It was. It speaks volumes about his talent and Charles's willingness to break with tradition. By 1380, the English had been pushed back significantly. They held only a few coastal cities.
It sounds like the tide was turning in France's favor.
Yeah.
But as you said earlier, nothing in war is ever simple. Both England and France were also dealing with internal problems during this period, weren't they?
Internal strife was plaguing both kingdoms. In England, Richard II was facing rebellions and political turmoil.
A young king struggling to maintain control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, in France, Charles VI started suffering from bouts of madness, which threw the French court into chaos.
Mental illness affecting the course of history. That's fascinating and tragic at the same time.
It really is. It highlights the human element in all of this.
So you've got both kingdoms weakened from within, even as they continue to fight each other. It seems like the perfect recipe for a lasting peace treaty.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the 100 Years' War was far from over.
Oh no, what happened next?
Well, a new player entered the scene, a young, ambitious English king named Henry V.
Henry V. Now things are getting interesting.
He saw France's weakness as an opportunity. He was ready to reignite the flames of war and claim what he believed was rightfully his, the French throne.
This is where things get really epic. Agincourt, Joan of Arc, all those iconic names and stories.
Exactly. But those stories, my friend, will have to wait for our next deep dive.
Oof. I hate cliffhangers, but I guess that's all the time we have for today.
Don't worry, we'll pick up right where we left off next time.
I can't wait. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into the 100 Years' War.
Yeah.
So when we left off, both England and France were kind of a mess, right? Dealing with all these internal struggles.
Yeah, definitely a time of upheaval on both sides of the channel.
But like we were saying, a power vacuum. It can be a breeding ground for ambition. And that brings us to Henry V, this young king ready to grab the reins and reignite the war, right?
Oh, absolutely, Henry V. He was a real fascinating figure. He's like the embodiment of that chivalric ideal, that warrior king, but also super ambitious, ruthless even.
So he saw France kind of falling apart and thought, perfect timing.
Basically, he saw an opportunity to seize what he believed was his, the French throne.
Yeah.
And he wasn't afraid to use any means necessary to get it.
And that leads us to, of course, Agincourt. One of those battles everyone's heard of. But didn't the English face, impossible odds there?
Yeah, they did. It was 1315 Henry's army. They were totally outnumbered by the French. But somehow, against all odds, he pulled off a stunning victory.
Agincourt. It's basically legendary.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the longbow earlier, right? That English longbow. Why was that such a game changer on the medieval battlefield?
Okay, so picture this. You're a French knight, all decked out in heavy armor. You're charging towards the enemy, right? And suddenly, you're hit with this barrage of arrows that can pierce right through your armor.
Ouch. That doesn't sound fun.
Not at all. That was the longbow. Longer range, faster rate of fire than anything the French had. It just decimated their ranks.
So, yeah, super effective.
Yeah.
But I've also read that Agincourt was, really brutal, even for medieval standards, right?
Yeah, it's true. Agincourt, it's a story of both military genius and the dark side of war, Henry, he was worried about those French prisoners, thought they might regroup and attack, so he made the call to execute them.
Wow. That's cold-blooded.
It was a brutal decision and controversial even back then. It shows how war can push people to do terrible things, even when they're winning.
Yeah, a reminder that victory can have a really dark side. But Agincourt, that was just the beginning for Henry V, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, it was just the start. He went on this whole conquest thing, captured huge chunks of French territory, like Normandy. It was like England was on the verge of actually taking the French crown.
And then that's where the Treaty of Troyes comes in, right? Totally changed the game.
The Treaty of Troy, 1420. It was a real power move, Henry V. He marries Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter,
Yeah.
and gets himself named heir to the French throne.
Whoa, wait, really? So he actually did it? Became the heir to the French throne?
He did. It's crazy, right? It seemed like England had finally won, achieved their ultimate goal.
I mean, talk about a plot twist. But did he actually become king of France?
Yo, that's the thing. Fate had other plans. Henry V, at the height of his power, he suddenly dies in 1422.
Oh, no, seriously?
Yeah, he left behind an infant son, Henry VI, to inherit, well, everything.
What a what-if moment in history. If Henry V had lived, would England have ruled France? It boggles the mind.
It really makes you think, huh? But with Henry V gone, things in France were still a mess. The English held a lot of land, but the French, they weren't giving up. And that's where a new figure comes into the picture, right? Joan of Arc.
Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who became a military leader, a legend. Her story, it's incredible and kind of heartbreaking, too.
Totally. So Joan of Arc, she was this young peasant woman, and she claimed to have these divine visions telling her to save France.
Divine visions, like from God.
That's what she believed. And fueled by her faith, this intense patriotism, she rose to become a military leader. It's extraordinary.
So she's like this teenage girl wearing armor, leading armies into battle. That must have been a sight to see.
Oh, it was. And her impact. It wasn't just symbolic either. In 1429, she led the French to victory at the Siege of Orleans, which was a major turning point in the war.
Why was Orleans such a big deal?
Well, Orleans was strategically vital, right? It was like the gateway to the south of France. If the English had taken it, they would have controlled a major trade route. Joan of Arc, she stopped them dead in their tracks.
That's pretty amazing. It's like one person's bravery changed the entire course of the war. But Joan's story, it doesn't have a happy ending, does it?
No, it doesn't. Tragically, she was captured by the Burgundians, allies of the English, and they handed her over to the English authorities.
Oh.
She was put on trial for heresy and witchcraft, and ultimately she was burned at the stake in 1431.
That's awful. So much courage. She saved her country, and that's how they repaid her. It's hard to believe.
It was a huge loss for France, but her legacy. It lived on Joan of Arc. She became a martyr, a symbol of French resistance, and her story, it continued to inspire the French to fight for their independence even after her death.
It's like even in death, she helps turn the tide of war. It's incredible the power of one person's conviction.
Yeah.
But what about the war itself? Did Joan of Arc's victory at Orleans, did that mean the English were done for?
Not right away. The war dragged on for a few more decades, but Joan of Arc's victory, it was a turning point for sure. The French, they were inspired by her. They started to regroup, rebuild.
So how did they finally win? Did they just outlast the English?
Well, it was more than that. The French, under Charles VII, they started using new strategies, new tactics, and they embraced, well, new technology that was changing how wars were fought.
What kind of changes are we talking about here? Like, did they ditch all that chivalry stuff and get more, I don't know, practical?
Yeah, pretty much. The 100 Years' War, it was this turning point, this shift away from the romanticized, chivalric way of war and more towards a professional, organized, brutal kind of fighting.
Like the days of knights in shining armor were over.
They were fading fast. And one of the biggest changes, the rise of professional standing armies, no more relying on feudal levies. Charles VII, he created this permanent professional army that was loyal to the crown, not to individual nobles.
So basically a real national army.
Exactly. It was a game changer. These guys, they trained year-round. They had better equipment, more discipline. They were a force to be reckoned with. And that shift to professional armies, it was a big reason why France ultimately won.
So the French, they were adapting to a new kind of war. What about technology? Were there any other big advancements that helped tip the scales?
Oh, there's one big one. Cannons. Gunpowder weapons had been around, but during the 100 Years' War, they became more common on the battlefield, especially cannons.
So it's not just swords and arrows anymore. Now you've got these massive cannons blasting away.
Exactly. And they were still pretty basic back then, but their impact was undeniable. They could smash castle walls, hurl projectiles across the battlefield. Imagine being an English soldier used to fighting hand-to-hand, and suddenly you're facing this terrifying new weapon.
That's got to mess with your head.
Oh, totally. And the Battle of Castillon in 1453, it's considered the last big battle of the 100 Years' War, and it really shows how important artillery had become. The French, they used cannons to crush the English forces.
So after 116 years, all that fighting back and forth, it finally ends. The 100 Years' War is over. What a journey.
It really is. But the story doesn't end there, right?
Of course not. We've got to talk about what happened next, right? The aftermath, the consequences for England, for France, for all of Europe.
That's what we're going to cover in our next deep dive. The Hundred Years' War, it left a mark on history that we still feel today.
Stay tuned, everyone. Okay, welcome back to this final part of our deep dive into the Hundred Years' War. So we've been through over a century of fighting, right? Epic battles, all the political drama, empires rising and falling, and now the dust settles. France is standing victorious.
Yeah.
But at what cost, right?
Yeah, victory always comes at a price.
And England. They lost all those territories in France. Must have been a huge blow, not just to their pride, but to their economy, too. What happened in England after we lost the war?
Well, imagine you're an English noble, right? Your family's had land and titles in France for generations, and suddenly, poof, it's all gone. Your wealth, your status, it's a tough pill to swallow. And for England as a whole, losing Gascony, that was a major blow to their economy.
Gascony, that was the wine region, right?
Yeah, a major source of income for the English crown. So you're right, it wasn't just about pride, it was about losing real economic power.
So it's this loss of identity, this hit to their national pride. Did that contribute to more problems back home?
Oh, it definitely did. The decades after the Hundred Years' War, England, they plunged into this period of internal conflict, the Wars of the Roses.
The Wars of the Roses, yeah, another one of those names that just screams English history. What was that all about?
Basically, it was this power struggle between two branches of the royal family, right? The House of Lancaster and the House of York.
Okay, two families fighting for the throne.
Exactly. They both claimed they had the right to rule. And all that resentment, all that ambition that had been building up for years, it just exploded into this brutal civil war.
So the Hundred Years' War, even though it was fought in France, it ended up contributing to a war in England. It's like all these events just domino into each other, you know?
That's history for you. It's all interconnected.
Yeah.
One thing leads to another.
Okay, so England is dealing with all this turmoil.
Hmm.
What about France? They won, but like we said, victory comes with a price.
Oh, yeah. The price France paid was steep. Decades of war. It ravaged the countryside. The population was decimated. The treasury was empty. Rebuilding was a huge challenge.
So it's like you said before, right? Winning the war is one thing, but then you have to win the peace.
Exactly. And that can be even harder.
But out of all that destruction, a new France was emerging, right?
It was. The war, as terrible as it was, it had forged this new sense of national unity. The French had come together, repelled a foreign invader, defended their homeland, and from that struggle, a stronger, more unified nation was born.
So even though they lost so much, they gained something too, this sense of being French together.
Exactly. And the monarchy, they came out of the war stronger too. They had proven they could protect the realm, so they gained more power, more authority. And the old feudal system was already weakening, but the war sped up that process too.
So it's like the war forced France to modernize, to adapt.
It did.
Yeah.
They had to change their military, their politics, everything. And that laid the foundation for the powerful nation-state France would become.
It's kind of a paradox, right? All that destruction led to a stronger, more unified country.
It's true. Sometimes conflict, even though it's terrible, it can be a catalyst for change.
So the Hundred Years' War had this huge impact on England and France, right? But what about the rest of Europe? Did it change things for them too?
Oh, absolutely. The Hundred Years' War, it wasn't just a local conflict. It had ripple effects throughout Europe. It changed the way people thought about war, and it hastened the decline of chivalry, that whole knightly code.
How so? How did it change military thinking across Europe?
Think about those innovations we talked about, right? The longbow, professional armies, cannons, these things, they spread, they influenced warfare everywhere. Armies across Europe were becoming more professional, tactics were evolving, and the old ways of fighting, the chivalric ideals, they were fading away, replaced by a more brutal, pragmatic reality.
Like chivalry couldn't keep up with cannons.
Exactly. The Hundred Years' War, it was this crucible, right? It forged new ways of waging war and those innovations. They shaped warfare for centuries to come.
So it wasn't just about who won or lost. It was about how war itself was changing.
Exactly. And beyond the battlefield, the Hundred Years' War, it was a sign that the medieval world was coming to an end and a new era was dawning. The old feudal order was crumbling. The nation-state, with its centralized power, its standing armies, that was the future.
It was like we're seeing the birth of modern Europe, right there in the middle of all this fighting.
In a way, yeah. It's fascinating, isn't it, how this one conflict, it lasted for over a century, and it had these huge consequences that shaped the world we live in today.
It really makes you think. And that's why we love doing these deep dives. It's not just about memorizing names and dates. It's about understanding the forces that have shaped our world, the echoes of the past that still resonate with us today.
Exactly. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, right? We trace the Hundred Years' War from its beginnings all the way to its lasting impact. But as always, there's so much more to explore.
It's true. We could spend hours talking about this. But I think it's time to wrap things up. Any final thoughts for our listeners out there?
Just this, the Hundred Years' War, it's a reminder that ambition, conflict, the struggle for power, these things, they're not just things of the past. They're as relevant today as they were centuries ago. And that's what makes history so compelling, so endlessly fascinating.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Hundred Years' War. We'll see you next time for another adventure through the annals of history. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.